The clock on the dashboard read 3:47 p.m. when Officer Morgan Tate first caught sight of Darius Reed walking down Maple Avenue. Darius, a 17-year-old African-American, had learned long ago that in a neighborhood like Riverside Grove, a predominantly white suburb with immaculate lawns and neatly lined sidewalks, being seen simply for being himself often invited unwanted attention. Today, however, the attention felt more invasive than ever. Darius had grown accustomed to the silent nods and furtive glances from passers-by, but he was determined not to let those judgments define him. With a pair of well-worn sneakers carrying him steadily along the pavement, he clutched a worn backpack filled with textbooks, a water bottle, and a pair of basketball shoes, a routine reminder of his simple yet determined life. As he walked, the late afternoon sun painted the neighborhood in hues of golden light, a gentle contrast to the inner turmoil he sometimes wrestled with in such moments. Unbeknownst to him, Officer Tate had been driving his patrol car with an intensity that betrayed a personal mission. As the vehicle slowed to a crawl on Maple Avenue, Tate's eyes locked onto Darius. In his mind, Darius was not merely a teenager on his way home from school, he was a symbol, a target, if you will, against whom preconceptions and biases were all too easily triggered. At first, Tate's approach seemed routine. He rolled down his window as the car eased to a stop beside Darius. A feeling of apprehension fluttered in Darius's chest, mingling with the remnants of his father's advice, be calm, be respectful. They see you, but remember your worth. With measured steps, Darius removed his headphones, the barrier that had momentarily isolated him from a world that now felt hostile, and met the eyes of his officer with a composed but wary expression. "Hold on a minute," Officer Tate called out, his tone laced with an authority that both commanded and unsettled. "What are you doing out here, son?" The question, so innocent on the surface, carried a weight that made Darius pause. His voice, though steady, trembled slightly as he replied, "I'm on my way home from school, sir." The simplicity of his response, however, did not satisfy Tate's suspicion. Darius's every step had been a silent assertion of his dignity. Yet, at that moment, he felt that dignity slipping away under the scrutiny of an officer whose preconceptions overpowered the facts. Tate's eyes roamed over Darius, a young man, barely 17, with no visible sign of any wrongdoing, and yet the officer's demeanor darkened. It was as if every unspoken word of judgment in the world converged onto that one scene. The crack in Tate's expression deepened when Darius's answer veered into territory he'd been drilled to avoid discussing openly. "My father, he's in covert operations," Darius offered quietly, as if that one statement might bridge the gap between a world full of injustice and the truth about his family's honor. But to Officer Tate, it was the spark that ignited years of prejudice into a flame of ridicule. "Tactics? Special ops? Your dad, huh?" Tate sneered before bursting into mocking laughter, a sound that ricocheted off the pristine houses of Riverside Grove and into the hearts of onlookers. The laughter was not just an expression of disbelief, it was a weapon aimed directly at Darius's pride. For Darius, it was a moment of agonizing betrayal, a signal that his truth was being twisted into a caricature for Tate's amusement. At that moment, time seemed to slow. Darius's senses sharpened as every detail etched itself in painful clarity, the hardened lines on Tate's face, the subtle gestures of disdain, and the shocked expressions of neighbors peering through drawn curtains and partially opened windows. The air crackled with an intensity that belied the mundane suburban street. Darius's heart pounded in his chest, not out of fear, but in defiant sorrow. Each beat echoed the lessons his father, Marcus Reed, had instilled in him about enduring injustice with silent strength. He remembered the quiet confidence in his father's eyes when he had taught him to meet prejudice not with anger but with a controlled resolve. That day, the lesson was put to the test under the unyielding glare of public shame. Officer Tate, emboldened by his own insecurities and internal demons, doubled his efforts to belittle Darius. His questions became increasingly invasive, probing for details about the Reed family's background. "Tell me, where exactly do you live?" he demanded. With a voice that remained as calm as the eye of a storm, Darius replied, "I live on Birchwood Lane, just a few blocks over." Every word Darius uttered was laced with the quiet dignity passed down from his father, dignity that the officer's mockery threatened to erode. As Darius slowly gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, a palpable tension swept the street. Bystanders absorbed the moment, their expressions ranging from sympathetic discomfort to overt disdain. For Darius, leaving wasn't a retreat, it was a demonstration of resilience, a refusal to allow this moment to dictate his identity. The exchange had sown a seed of unease not only in Darius but in the entire neighborhood. Shadows of whispered conversations and furtive glances spread like a ripple through Riverside Grove. That day, the amber glow of dusk could not erase the dark stain of bias from the hearts of those who witnessed the encounter. Darius walked away with his head held high, though his mind churned with a tumult of emotions. The reassurance of his father's teachings overpowered the inner sting left by Officer Tate's cruelty. Still, as he rounded the corner, Darius couldn't escape the feeling that this was only the beginning, a single drop in an ocean of challenges yet to come. In the comforting solitude of his home, Darius replayed every moment of that encounter. The mocking laughter, the invasive questions, and that singular moment when his father's honor became a target for ridicule all mingled into a profound sense of injustice. Amidst the quiet ticking of the living room clock, he wondered what this meant for his future, for his family, and for a community that prided itself on civility yet masked subtle, unyielding prejudice. Little did Darius know that within the depths of his own quiet strength lay the beginnings of a story much larger than this one encounter. It was a story that would weave together the threads of honor, resilience, and ultimately, the fight for justice. It would bring to light long-suppressed family secrets and test the bonds between those who dared to stand up against a system that too often mistook quiet perseverance for weakness. As the day drew to a close and the sky turned a deep, reflective blue, Darius sat by his bedroom window. The city lights flickered in the distance as he pondered the questions that now loomed over his existence. How could he continue to walk confidently when every step seemed to invite scrutiny? How might his father's legacy, shrouded in mystery yet imbued with honor, guide him through a world that refused to see the true depth of his identity? The clash between individual dignity and societal bias had been set into motion by a single, painful encounter on Maple Avenue, a moment that resonated far beyond the confines of that suburban street. It was a clarion call, both for Darius and for those who would later come to see him as a beacon of quiet defiance. His journey was only beginning, and the echoes of that fateful afternoon would shape the unfolding narrative of his life in ways he could scarcely imagine. What would you do if you witnessed such an injustice? How would you stand up for yourself, or for someone else who is being treated unfairly? Let us know your thoughts. In the days following that fateful encounter on Maple Avenue, Riverside Grove was never quite the same. The incident with Officer Morgan Tate and Darius Reed had stirred a restless undercurrent across the quiet suburb. While most residents tried to resume their routines, whispers of injustice and simmering tensions echoed through every manicured lawn and behind every drawn curtain. Darius returned to his daily life with the heavy burden of that moment etched into his memory. At school, his once untroubled walk down the hallways became a slow, cautious journey. The incident was not just a solitary moment of humiliation, it had become a symbol, discussed in hushed tones by classmates and debated fiercely in the school's corridors. Teachers attempted to address the racial tensions in carefully worded statements, yet the raw emotions of the incident refused to be tamed. At home, Marcus Reed, Darius's father, sensed the change immediately. A seasoned veteran with a past shrouded in noble secrecy, Marcus had always fought his battles quietly. But now, as he observed his son's subdued demeanor, a protective fierceness sparked within him. He recalled the long nights spent teaching Darius about honor, resilience, and the power of silent dignity amid adversity. Now, the lessons took on an urgent, personal flavor. Marcus began gathering fragments of what had transpired. Late one evening, while Darius was immersed in homework at the kitchen table under the soft glow of a single lamp, Marcus sifted through police reports and neighborhood chatter on community forums. His heart sank as he discovered reports of biased police patrols, several minor incidents that had been swept under the rug, and a pattern of unchecked mistrust toward young people like his son. It was clear to him that Officer Tate's behavior was symptomatic of a broader malaise seeping into the community. The local community, too, was awakening. Angela Carter, a longtime resident of Riverside Grove and owner of the popular neighborhood cafe, Crescent Brew, became an unexpected voice of reason and resistance. Angela had always been known for her warm smile and no-nonsense attitude. As she served coffee and pastries to her regulars, she discreetly began collecting testimonies and recounting her own encounters with subtle acts of discrimination on Maple Avenue. She posted thoughtful, impassioned messages on community bulletin boards and local social media groups, urging her neighbors to stand together against the creeping tide of intolerance. Meanwhile, Officer Tate, emboldened by his earlier actions yet increasingly isolated by the criticism that began to seep into official channels, found himself in a conflict of loyalties. In the precinct, murmurs circulated among fellow officers, a mix of skepticism and uneasy solidarity. Tate maintained his hardened facade, but late at night, when the silence of his small apartment pressed in upon him, he began reviewing the incident footage with a critical eye. His initial laughter and dismissive demeanor replayed over and over in his mind, gradually morphing into a gnawing sense of self-doubt. Was it possible that he had allowed his own insecurities to dictate his actions? Did his need to enforce authority blind him to the humanity before him? For Darius, the repercussions were felt in subtle yet profound ways. At school, rumors flew like wildfire. Some students expressed their support for him, while others, fueled by long-standing stereotypes, continued to cast aspersions on his character. Even the school's guidance counselor, Ms. Evelyn Burke, struggled to bridge the divide. She organized small group discussions on respect and equality, but the trauma of being singled out in public had already left deep scars. In one such group meeting after school, Darius sat silently among his peers, listening as Ms. Burke gently probed the underlying feelings of anger and hurt. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you fight within," she said softly, her eyes kind yet firm. Darius's gaze dropped to the table, his mind racing back to the cold, mocking laughter of Officer Tate. He wondered if the dignity his father had instilled in him was enough to shield him from a world that seemed intent on breaking his spirit. At home, an unexpected visitor added another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. Maya Lawson, a spirited and inquisitive 18-year-old with a knack for technology and a passion for justice, had recorded the entire incident from a discreet vantage point across the street. Initially, she had hesitated to share her recording, fearing retribution from those in power. However, as the days passed and the police department's inaction became apparent, Maya realized that her footage might be the key to galvanizing public sentiment. Late one night, she uploaded her video to a secure social media platform popular among activists and local community members. The video's impact was immediate. Within hours, it ignited a torrent of discussions and criticisms about systemic bias and abuse of power in Riverside Grove. Public sentiment began to coalesce around the notion that there was a need for reform, a cry for accountability that could no longer be suppressed. For many families, particularly those of color, the incident resonated as a familiar, painful pattern that had long been ignored. Marcus, determined to channel his rising anger into constructive action, reached out to local leaders. With Angela's backing, he organized a town hall meeting to address the community's concerns. The meeting was set to take place in the renovated town hall, a once-forgotten building now pulsing with the promise of change. Flyers were printed and distributed at local shops, and word spread fast among community groups. For the first time, a cross-section of Riverside Grove's residents, black, white, Hispanic, and others, gathered with the common goal of demanding justice and reform from their local law enforcement. As the evening of the meeting arrived, the town hall filled beyond capacity. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmur of overlapping conversations providing a backdrop to this moment of collective resolve. Amid the crowd, Marcus sat near the front, his expression a blend of calm determination and quiet sadness. Every face in the room carried the weight of shared experience. When Angela took the stage, her voice rang clear and unwavering as she recounted her own moments of silent suffering and the need for change. The discussion moved from personal anecdotes to a broader critique of policies that had allowed prejudice to flourish unchecked. Angela pressed for the establishment of an independent oversight board for the police department and for mandatory bias training, emphasizing that the fight for equality was not about punishing one man or one department, but about healing a community long divided by fear and misunderstanding. Back in the precinct, Officer Tate's superiors were not blind to the growing unrest. A senior detective, whose name was only whispered among his colleagues as Detective Warren, began an internal review of Tate's conduct. Although the initial trigger for the review was the disturbing reaction from the community following the incident, it soon became evident that the matter ran deeper. Several officers, too, had quietly expressed concern over Tate's increasingly aggressive tactics, and a culture of tolerance for such behavior was coming under fire from within as well. For Tate, the review was both a source of anxiety and a catalyst for introspection. As he sat alone in the precinct's break room one rainy afternoon, the soft tapping of raindrops on the window echoed the soft, relentless ticking of his conscience. Memories of mentorship from his own father, a man who had served honorably without ever resorting to brutality, haunted him. He recognized that, somewhere between the pride of enforcing the law and the need to be a figure of authority, he had lost sight of the underlying duty to protect and serve with integrity. While the police department wrestled with its internal demons, the community's momentum only grew. Marcus, Angela, and Maya began meeting privately to devise a strategy that would ensure accountability without inciting further violence. They envisioned a series of peaceful demonstrations and creative initiatives that would not only challenge the status quo but also empower the victims of systemic injustice. Darius, though still reeling from the incident, found solace in these gatherings. He started attending community meetings and even volunteered at local youth centers, slowly transforming his experience of humiliation into a driving force for change. One crisp evening, as twilight set in and the town hall's lights cast long shadows across the street, a small group of activists gathered outside in quiet defiance. They held signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Respect, not ridicule," their expressions resolute. Among them, Darius's younger sister, Tasha Reed, who until now had been a quiet observer in the family's turbulent story, emerged as a fierce advocate for her brother's dignity. With a mix of youthful courage and the wisdom of someone far beyond her years, Tasha challenged the local media's narrow portrayals and offered a powerful narrative, that the incident was not isolated but representative of a much larger struggle that touched every life in Riverside Grove. The energy of the community was palpable, as was the sense of possibility. Every conversation, every meeting, and every act of protest was a stitch in a growing tapestry of change. For Marcus, the incident became not only a personal call to protect his son but also a rallying point for long overdue transformation in the town's social fabric. He spent long nights drafting letters to local government officials and reaching out to activists and community leaders from neighboring towns, determined to ensure that Riverside Grove would not be defined by prejudice. Even as the wheels of change began turning, the repercussions of the incident extended beyond Riverside Grove. News outlets picked up the story, each narrative spinning the tale in different tones, from sensational headlines in tabloid-style reports to deeply analytical pieces in respected national newspapers. The national conversation started to shift, and for many, Darius Reed became a symbol of the silent yet powerful resistance against systemic injustice. Maya's expertly edited video, with its poignant background score and heartfelt testimonials, went viral, capturing the attention of audiences across the country. It was an image of raw vulnerability set against the backdrop of a society that demanded respect and accountability. Officer Tate, now the subject of a contentious internal review and public scrutiny, found himself standing at a crossroads. His future in law enforcement hung in the balance, his every action dissected and debated by both his critics and those who still believed in his potential for redemption. In the solitude of his small apartment, with the relentless tapping of the rain mingling with the memories of that critical day, Tate could no longer ignore the gnawing realization that the incident had forever altered his path. He was faced with a choice: to continue down a road of unchecked authority and bias, or to embrace a journey of transformation and self-awareness, a road that could mend the fractures not only within himself but in the very system he was meant to uphold. As the community rallied together in peaceful protest and public debate, the ripple effects of that one encounter on Maple Avenue promised to redefine Riverside Grove's future. With every shared story of injustice, every thoughtful statement from a concerned citizen, and every call for reform, the walls of prejudice began to crumble. In the collective heartbeat of a community demanding fairness, there was hope, a hope that the wounds of the past would heal, and that a new, just chapter could be written in the narrative of Riverside Grove. What do you think is the most important step in rebuilding trust within a community after such an incident? How would you act if you were in Darius's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. In the aftermath of the town hall meeting that had electrified every corner of Riverside Grove, a palpable tension began to reverberate through the community. While the call for reform and accountability had brought citizens together in a rare display of unity, the ripple effects of that momentum quickly collided with established interests, both within the law enforcement ranks and in the hearts of those whose views had long remained unchallenged. Darius Reed, though still recovering from the public humiliation inflicted by Officer Morgan Tate, found himself increasingly drawn into the swirling storm of activism. Every time he walked past the familiar storefronts of Riverside Grove, from the quaint Crescent Brew Cafe, where Angela Carter now presided as an informal community spokesperson, to the neighborhood parks where older residents gathered for morning chats, he sensed a new kind of vigilance. The residents were no longer silent observers, their eyes, once clouded by apathy or conformity, now shone with a mixture of determination and guarded optimism. At school, the corridors that had been marred by whispered rumors and alienation were slowly becoming a canvas for change. Student groups formed with clear objectives, to monitor police interactions, to promote diversity and inclusion, and to provide a safe space for those who had suffered silent injustices. Darius attended these meetings with a blend of reluctance and resolve. Each session was a reminder of the weight of his own experience, yet also a spark that ignited hope. He quietly assumed a leadership role among his peers, not by forceful declaration, but by simply embodying the resilience that his father, Marcus Reed, had long instilled in him. Marcus, too, was a fulcrum amid the mounting pressures. Having spent countless nights poring over documentation from the incident and conducting his own inquiries into the patterns of harassment within the police department, he came to a stark realization: change would not be handed down from above, it must be forged from within, with steady, unyielding hands. With Angela Carter's encouragement, Marcus set about organizing community workshops on legal rights, self-advocacy, and nonviolent protest strategies. His living room turned into an impromptu meeting place, where neighbors, activists, and even some sympathetic local officials gathered in earnest discussion. The conversations ranged from the nuances of constitutional protections to the everyday tactics of de-escalation in confrontational scenarios. In those gatherings, the community began to see itself as a collective guardian of justice, a united front against the remnants of institutional bias. For Officer Tate, the new wave of scrutiny was an unbearable weight that he neither anticipated nor completely understood. Confined within the sterile walls of the precinct during his ongoing internal review, he felt the isolation of a man whose every move was dissected by colleagues, inspectors, and the shifting sentiments of a community he once thought he served. Late at night, as rain pattered insistently against his window, Tate replayed the events over and over in his mind. The sound of his own laughter, a derisive echo of that fateful afternoon, haunted him with a bitter reminder of a moment when his authority had been misused. Now, as whispers of reform and compassion began to grow louder, he was forced to confront the realization that he might have been part of the problem all along. The atmosphere within the Riverside Grove Police Department grew increasingly strained. Detective Warren, a veteran whose steady presence was once a beacon of moderation, began questioning long-standing practices with a courage that bordered on defiance. "We're not here to intimidate, we're here to protect and serve," he often reminded his colleagues in quiet moments away from prying ears. His calls for internal reform were met with resistance by some, but gradually, the seeds of self-reflection started to take root, even in places where they had long been forbidden. Meanwhile, the media's gaze intensified. Maya Lawson's viral video continued to fuel the national debate. Comments poured in from viewers across the country, some offering words of support, others challenging the narrative. Within days, local newspapers, once reticent on matters of police conduct, ran investigative pieces exploring not only Officer Tate's record but the broader historical context of systemic bias in communities like Riverside Grove. With each published article, the spotlight grew harsher, revealing flaws in a system many had taken for granted. Among the flurry of media attention and community action, an unexpected meeting was arranged in the Old Town Library, a centuries-old building that had seen its share of history and change. It was here that Marcus Reed and several local activists, including Angela Carter and a few trusted residents, gathered to discuss a delicate strategy: how to initiate a review of police protocols, an overhaul of training programs, and a re-examination of accountability measures. The library's high-arched windows and wooden shelves steeped in history gave the conversation a gravity that was hard to ignore. Marcus opened the meeting by sharing his own story, the personal cost of witnessing his son's dignity being trampled on the pavement. "We are not just fighting a single incident," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "We are fighting a legacy of silence, of fear, of unchallenged power. Today, I ask you, what do we stand for? What kind of Riverside Grove do we want to create for our children?" One by one, voices in the room rose in quiet affirmation, the murmur of agreement building into a collective pulse of determination. Outside of these deliberations, tension in the streets escalated subtly but unmistakably. Several routine patrols began changing routes, and new signs of increased surveillance came into view, not of community cameras, but of those placed by independent oversight groups formed by local citizens. The very fabric of trust that had once woven the peaceful suburban life was now being reassembled, thread by careful thread. Yet, not everyone welcomed these changes. A small but vocal group of longtime residents, clinging to old prejudices and wary of a rapidly changing community, began to protest what they viewed as an overreach by activists. They met in dimly lit basements, sharing grievances about losing the traditional way of life, a phrase that hung in the air as much as any explicit xenophobia. Tensions, though contained, threatened to erupt into open conflict if not addressed with caution and empathy. Amid this turbulent backdrop, Darius found himself torn between two parallel worlds. On one hand, he was the victim of bias and injustice, a young man whose daily steps carried the invisible burdens of unequal judgment. On the other, he was emerging as a reluctant spokesperson for a movement dedicated to carving out a more just, inclusive future. His interactions with his peers became more deliberate. He spent hours tutoring younger students and mentoring them on how to stand tall amid adversity. His quiet resolve turned into a source of inspiration, a beacon that subtly reshaped the self-image of those around him. One particularly brisk autumn evening, as the wind swept leaves in swirling patterns across Birchwood Lane, Darius encountered a moment that would forever change his perception of his own role. While walking home from a late meeting with the student council in support of the Oversight Board proposal, he was accosted by a group of teenagers who had previously been indifferent to his plight. Their words, filled with a mix of confusion and derision, challenged the very ideas he had fought for. "You think you're some kind of hero now?" they jeered. "Is that why you keep acting like you're better than us?" For a split second, Darius's heart pounded with the familiar sting of rejection. Yet, as he met their eyes with the calm grace taught to him by his father, he responded softly, "I'm not trying to be a hero, I'm just trying to see us treated with the respect we deserve." His words, quiet but firm, left the group momentarily speechless, a silent victory that bolstered his resolve to lead by example rather than by force. That same night, as Riverside Grove lay under a blanket of starlight, Officer Tate sat alone in his modest apartment, a single desk lamp casting long shadows across his tired face. In a moment of rare vulnerability, he penned a letter, one that he never intended to send, detailing his inner conflict and the realization that he had perhaps lost sight of the very values he was meant to embody. The letter was a cathartic outpouring, a confession to himself of his failures, and a tentative olive branch toward a path of redemption. However, fate had its own plans, and the letter remained locked away in a drawer, a secret testament to a man battling his inner demons. While the ripples of these personal transformations and conflicts spread through Riverside Grove, the external pressures mounted in tandem. Local authorities, now under the scrutiny of a vigilant public and emboldened by the outpouring of community voices, announced plans for a comprehensive review of police practices. New policies were drafted with input from community leaders, and independent monitors were to be appointed to ensure that any abuses of power would be swiftly addressed. The seeds of reform, nurtured through countless conversations and shared experiences, began to sprout, promising a future where fear would no longer dictate the interactions between citizens and those sworn to protect them. As the dawn of a new chapter slowly broke through the lingering darkness of past injustices, Riverside Grove found itself at a crossroads, a place where accountability, redemption, and hope converged. The story of Darius Reed and his family was no longer isolated but had become emblematic of the struggles and triumphs of countless others in the community. Each day that passed carried with it the possibility of transformation, and every shared voice was a building block for a more equitable future. In the midst of this unfolding drama, questions loomed large. Could a fragmented community truly heal from deep-seated prejudices, and would the forces of old, entrenched in tradition and fear, ever yield to the transformative call for justice? As Riverside Grove wrestled with these uncertainties, one thing was clear: the fight for dignity and respect had only just begun. What actions would you take if you were faced with unjust authority? And how do you think communities can bridge the gap between old fears and a hopeful future? Share your thoughts below. As the days turned into weeks, Riverside Grove found itself standing on fragile ground, a precarious equilibrium in which old habits and emerging ideals clashed with a ferocity that no one had foreseen. The palpable momentum of reform was now mingled with a sense of vulnerability, as the community braced for the next wave of unforeseen consequences. For Darius Reed, each day felt like the slow unraveling of a fabric he had once thought secure. At school, his days were marked by a bittersweet cocktail of cautious optimism and gnawing uncertainty. His peers looked to him not just as a survivor of injustice but as a reluctant leader in a cause that had become larger than any one individual. In the classroom, discussions about rights and equality had shifted from abstract debates into personal struggles, stories of quiet defiance shared in whispered tones during lunch breaks, or in the forced smiles exchanged in the corridors. In these moments, Darius became more than just the boy who had been humiliated on Maple Avenue. He embodied the spirit of a generation unwilling to cower before discrimination. At home, the Reed household buzzed with a new kind of energy. Marcus Reed, having long been a man of few words, had taken to long nights at the kitchen table with stacks of legal pamphlets, community meeting flyers, and handwritten letters addressed to local government officials. His determination to spearhead change was both admirable and burdensome, the legacy of his own secret past mingled with the urgency of protecting his son in a world that was only starting to awaken to the dangers of unchecked authority. Angela Carter, whose cafe had become the informal rallying point for community activists, began to organize weekend forums that doubled as support groups and strategy sessions. Her warm presence provided the emotional ballast that many needed, a calm counterpoint to the rising storm outside. Across town, the Riverside Grove Police Department was reeling from the mounting pressures from within and without. Detective Warren, whose quiet insistence on integrity had inspired many of his colleagues, found himself isolated amid a growing faction that resisted change. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, he warned that any failure to genuinely address the systemic issues would only lead to further mistrust and division, a sentiment echoed in the stern glances exchanged during roll calls. Officer Morgan Tate, still under internal review, had become a pariah in his own ranks. The reflective hours in his dimly lit apartment were filled with regretful memories and feverish contemplation. Late at night, he would stare at the blank pages of unsent letters, confessions of remorse that he dared not share. The taste of his own past arrogance now curdled into a bitter recognition: he had been part of a machine that turned human dignity into a casualty. Amid these internal struggles, external forces began to assert themselves in unexpected ways. Maya Lawson, whose viral video had catapulted the incident into the national spotlight, started receiving messages from activists and journalists seeking interviews. While her work continued unabated, Maya also grew increasingly cautious, aware that her every digital footprint was now a subject of scrutiny by not only community advocates but also by factions within law enforcement desperate to regain control of the narrative. On one particularly cool autumn evening, as she scrolled through a flurry of email requests and social media comments, Maya paused. She realized that the story was transforming from a local injustice into a full-blown media spectacle, a story of fault lines that extended far beyond Riverside Grove's borders. Meanwhile, Marcus organized a series of town hall debates at the old Civic Center, a grand building with faded murals and echoing hallways that had once been the pride of a bygone era. The debates were designed to be honest and unscripted, forcing all voices, from the most conservative elders to the youngest activists, to confront the painful realities of systemic injustice. On the night of the first debate, the center overflowed with residents eager to share their stories or demand answers. Marcus took the stage with a steady, resolute presence. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he declared, his voice resonating in the vast space. "It's about reclaiming our dignity, acknowledging our past, and building a future where every resident feels safe and respected." His words stirred a murmur of agreement among the crowd, though not all were willing to let go of their ingrained fears. During that debate, a heated exchange erupted between an older resident, Mr. Harold Benson, and a young activist, Lena Ortiz. Benson, a lifelong resident whose opinions were molded by decades of isolation and a fierce attachment to tradition, insisted, "You all want to throw away our way of life for the sake of some idealistic fantasy." In response, Lena countered passionately, "What you call tradition is a chain that has bound us in silence for far too long. We deserve progress, and that progress starts with honesty." The clash of viewpoints underscored the complexity of the changes underway, each word a reminder that transformation always comes with a cost. Later that week, an anonymous tip reached the hands of a small group of investigative journalists from a local online news platform. The tip hinted at a series of internal communications from a faction within the police department, suggesting that certain officers had been actively obstructing reform efforts. The leak, once confirmed, sent shockwaves through Riverside Grove. Detective Warren, despite the risks, stepped forward, offering his own account of how entrenched power dynamics were being used to stifle transparency. His testimony, broadcast in an exclusive interview, lent undeniable credibility to the community's calls for change. Yet, for Officer Tate, it was a final nail in the coffin of his already crumbling reputation, a stark demonstration that his actions were not isolated misjudgments but part of a pervasive culture of injustice. In the midst of these unfolding events, Darius found himself at a crossroads. His role in the burgeoning movement was no longer merely symbolic, he was thrust into situations where his voice carried weight. One crisp morning, during a student meeting called to discuss the formation of an independent oversight committee for the local police, Darius shared his personal experience with a raw honesty that left everyone in the room silent for a moment. "I have always believed that respect isn't given, it's earned," he said, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "Today, I stand here not as a victim, but as someone who refuses to let a single moment define my future. We deserve better, and I promise, together, we will build a better Riverside Grove." His words resonated, sparking a round of applause that reverberated through the makeshift auditorium. Yet, amid the public calls for accountability, a more clandestine struggle was brewing in the shadows. Within the police department, certain high-ranking officials, alarmed by the rapid erosion of public trust, began to mobilize a counter-effort designed to restore order by any means necessary. Rumors circulated that a covert task force was being assembled, a group tasked not with reform, but with re-establishing control through methods that were, at best, ambiguous and, at worst, openly authoritarian. Officer Tate, now an unwilling scapegoat, found himself caught between these machinations and the relentless pursuit of personal redemption. His every move was monitored, his communications intercepted, and his reputation further tarnished by whispers of collusion. In these dark moments, the man who had once exuded unbridled authority now was reduced to a figure shrouded in regret and isolation. One chilly evening, as the wind howled through the bare branches lining Birchwood Lane, Marcus received an unexpected visit from a former colleague, a retired community liaison officer who had been a staunch advocate of police reform in his heyday. The man, known simply as Mr. Donovan, carried with him not only a briefcase full of documents but also a sense of urgency that hinted at dangers beyond local jurisdiction. "Marcus," he said in a gravelly voice, "the situation in Riverside Grove is spiraling. I've seen this play out before on a bigger scale. If you don't act now, things will only get worse, and I mean much worse." The weight of Donovan's words settled heavily over Marcus, igniting a fire of resolve that pushed him to explore alliances with reform-minded officials at the state level. Determined to prevent his community from descending into chaos, Marcus began drafting proposals that would not only hold officers accountable but also reshape the very structure of local law enforcement. As days blurred into nights, Riverside Grove became a microcosm of a national struggle, a community caught in the throes of a conflict that pitted old prejudice against emerging progress. The debates, the protests, the leaked documents, and the raw testimonies all formed a tapestry of tension that was both beautiful in its complexity and tragic in its ramifications. For the residents, every whispered conversation and every public demonstration was a small act of rebellion against a system that had, for too long, allowed power to go unchecked. In the midst of it all, Darius often found solace in the quiet corners of his favorite reading spot, the old tree-lined park at the edge of town. There, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak, he would sit for hours, lost in thought. The park, with its gentle rustling of leaves and the soft murmur of distant voices, offered a fleeting escape from the overwhelming currents of change. In those solitary moments, Darius reflected on the profound lessons he had learned from both the beauty and the brutality of life. Every scar, every whispered word of support, every defiant act of courage had molded him into someone who could no longer remain silent. One such reflective afternoon, as sunlight dappled through the leaves and the world around him seemed at peace, Darius scribbled in a battered notebook. His words were a mixture of poetry and raw, unfiltered emotion, a diary of resistance and hope. "I have seen the darkness within our community," he wrote, "but I have also seen the sparks of light that refuse to be extinguished. We are more than our scars, we are a promise of change waiting to be fulfilled." His words would later circulate among his peers, becoming a rallying cry for those who believed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, dignity and resilience could triumph. While the public narrative was dominated by meetings and protests, some of the most powerful moments of transformation occurred behind closed doors. Angela Carter, once the unassuming owner of a neighborhood cafe, began mentoring a group of young women who wanted to understand the intricacies of community organizing. In the warm, inviting atmosphere of Crescent Brew, conversations flowed freely about the power of collective action, personal stories of discrimination, and dreams of a future where everyone was treated with fairness and respect. Angela's gentle wisdom and unwavering determination inspired those around her to envision a different kind of society, one where empathy and truth were the cornerstones of every interaction. At the same time, Detective Warren took cautious steps to bridge the widening gap between the police department and the community. In a bid to rehabilitate trust, he initiated outreach programs aimed at engaging directly with residents, organizing informal, coffee with a cop sessions that allowed citizens to voice their concerns and ask difficult questions in a safe, open setting. While not all were receptive to these efforts, the small gestures of understanding began to chip away at the hardened walls of mistrust, one conversation at a time. As Riverside Grove stood at this critical crossroads, each decision in every conversation carried the potential to shape its future profoundly. In boardrooms, community centers, and even the quiet corners of local parks, residents grappled with the weight of their collective history, a history marred by mistakes and injustices, yet also illuminated by moments of redemption and hope. In the midst of a sweeping change that touched every facet of life in Riverside Grove, questions loomed large. Could the ghosts of the past be exorcised, allowing a new era of accountability and compassion to take root? Was it possible for those who had once wielded power without oversight to genuinely transform and return to the fold of trust? And, most poignantly, what legacy would be left for the next generation, one defined by division, or one forged in the fires of unified resolve? As the community wrestled with these challenges, the silent strength of those like Darius, Marcus, Angela, and even a few reflective souls within the police department began to light the way forward. Their stories, intertwined with both hope and sorrow, served as a testament to the complexity of human nature and the relentless pursuit of justice. In a final moment of quiet determination that would reverberate through the ages, Darius closed his notebook and looked up at the setting sun, its golden rays casting long shadows across the park. He knew that the journey was far from over, that the fault lines of injustice still ran deep, and that every step forward required sacrifice. Yet, in that tranquil moment, surrounded by a community that had risen to meet its own demons, he felt a profound certainty: together, they could reshape their world. What do you believe is the hardest barrier to overcome in a community grappling with long-standing injustice? How can personal transformation spark collective change? Share your thoughts and join the conversation. In the weeks that followed the explosive debates and secret maneuvers within the corridors of Riverside Grove's institutions, the community found itself teetering on the edge of transformation and uncertainty. The sweeping calls for accountability had disrupted not only the daily lives of ordinary residents but had unsettled long-entrenched power structures. In this turbulent period, the air was thick with anticipation, a relentless hum of change that could be felt in every whispered conversation, every heated discussion in cramped living rooms, and every determined stride taken by citizens who refused to accept the status quo. Darius Reed was at the center of a storm that now extended far beyond his personal pain. At school, his once overlooked presence had become a symbol of resilience. Every time he walked the hallways, a mix of admiration, envy, and trepidation followed his every step. His peers increasingly saw him as both an ambassador for change and a reminder of a painful past that many longed to forget. But even as he bore the weight of expectation, Darius was determined not to let the burden crush him. Instead, he embraced his role with a quiet fortitude that had been nurtured by the lessons passed down from his father, Marcus Reed. Marcus, ever the diligent architect of community unity, had become an indefatigable force behind the relentless push for reform. With Angela Carter's unwavering support and Maya Lawson's relentless coverage in digital forums, he forged new alliances with local lawmakers and progressive figures from neighboring towns. Late nights found Marcus hunched over his desk, diligently drafting policy proposals and letters of concern to higher government officials, all while fielding calls from community organizers who looked to him for guidance. Every detail in his meticulously kept notes bore the mark of a man who understood that the fight for justice was not a fleeting battle, it was a campaign for the soul of Riverside Grove. At Crescent Brew, Angela's cafe had transformed into a bustling hub of activism. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the charged energy of impassioned discussions as locals gathered to share their stories and pool ideas for future protests. Angela, ever the empathetic mentor, navigated each conversation with a steady hand, offering not only nourishment for the body but sustenance for the spirit. The cafe walls soon bore the colorful murals of hope and renewal, a visual testament to the community's enduring spirit. In every corner, from the mismatched chairs to the handwritten bulletin boards, lay evidence of a grassroots movement determined to reclaim dignity in an era marred by injustice. Yet, not all were aligned with the promise of reform. Deep within the police department, an undercurrent of defiance simmered among a faction that clung to the old ways, afraid of the irrevocable changes that might rip apart the familiar fabric of authority. Detective Warren, despite his earnest attempts to bridge the gap, found himself increasingly isolated. His public outreach initiatives, what he called coffee and community, suffered from lukewarm attendance and even colder receptions from officers unready to confront their past misdeeds. At home, Warren's heart grew heavy with the burden of watching colleagues degrade into shadows of their former selves, and each day he wondered if integrity could ever triumph over the entrenched resistance to change. Officer Morgan Tate, whose internal review had cast a long shadow over his career, became a reluctant emblem of the system's failure to hold itself accountable. His existence was now defined by whispered condemnations in precinct hallways and public disdain that seeped through every news cycle. In the rare hours when he found himself alone, Tate grappled with memories of a simpler time, a time when he believed his role was to serve and protect without prejudice. Now, his future loomed uncertain, an open wound slowly festering as he lay awake at night, haunted by his own reflection in the mirror. His remorse, once a private torment, now played out in every resentful headline, every biting commentary from critics, and every questioning glance cast his way by those who had once trusted him. Amid this turmoil, a fateful incident brought the simmering unrest to a dramatic climax. One crisp, windy evening, as dark clouds gathered over Riverside Grove, an anonymous informant passed on a critical document to Marcus Reed, an internal memo from within the police department that revealed plans for a covert task force. This force, the document claimed, was being assembled not to pursue accountability but to rein in the burgeoning movement through a combination of intimidation and clandestine operations. The very idea sent a shiver through the already uneasy community. Marcus felt a surge of righteous anger and immediately called Angela and Maya to meet at his modest home, transforming his living room into an emergency operations center. The trio pored over every word of the damning memo under the dim light of a single desk lamp. Maya's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the digital copy on her laptop, and Angela's eyes burned with indignation as Marcus read the details aloud. The memo, rife with coded language and bureaucratic evasions, uncovered a plan to suppress dissent through targeted raids, surveillance of community meetings, and, most chillingly, the possibility of false charges fabricated against protest leaders. This revelation jolted them into action. They immediately disseminated the information to trusted community leaders, activists, and sympathetic local media outlets, ensuring that the news would not be buried beneath official denials. In the public sphere, the disclosure ignited a firestorm of protest. Rallying cries echoed through Riverside Grove as community members, clad in homemade signs and fueled by a mingled cocktail of fear and determination, assembled near the town center. Marcus addressed the gathering with a voice that resonated like a clarion call: "They fear our voice because they know we cannot be silenced. We must stand together, hold them accountable, and ensure that our rights are not bargained away in the shadow of fear." His words were met with a thunderous cheer, as if every resident was lending their voice to a chorus that refused to be subdued. Darius, caught in the eye of this maelstrom, felt both the weight of expectation and the spark of a newfound courage. No longer could he be seen solely as a victim of prejudice, he was now a bridge between the old and the new, a living symbol of resistance and hope. Yet, as he walked home that night along the rain-slicked sidewalks of Birchwood Lane, questions plagued his mind. He wondered how far the task force's plans would stretch, what lengths would be taken to rein in the tide of dissent, and whether this new wave of unrest would ultimately lead to healing, or deeper division. As the weeks advanced, the repercussions of the leaked memo reached far beyond Riverside Grove. Local government officials, under intense pressure from advocacy groups and outraged residents, convened a special legislative session to discuss sweeping reforms in police oversight. In a packed chamber filled with passionate testimony from community members, experts, and even a few reformed officers, a robust debate unfolded. Proposals for an independent civilian review board, transparent disciplinary procedures, and mandatory training on implicit bias were tabled and fiercely debated. Every word was laden with the weight of history and the desperate hope for a future where justice was not an abstract ideal but a living, breathing reality. On the opposing side, hardline officials and supporters of the police force balked at the proposals, arguing that the radical shift would undermine the very institutions designed to protect society. Their voices, though loud, were met with steely resolve from those who had suffered too long under a system marred by unchecked power. In every heated exchange, the narrative was clear: Riverside Grove was at a crossroads, and every decision made in those stormy hours could either mend the fractures of the past or deepen the wounds for generations to come. For Officer Tate, this was a moment of reckoning. The mounting evidence against the covert task force and the undeniable outcry from the community left him isolated in a sea of judgment. In a brief, private meeting with Detective Warren, a man whose quiet persistence had earned him grudging admiration even among dissenters, Tate expressed a longing for redemption. "I wish I could go back," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "to the time when I believed I was protecting the people I swore to serve." Warren's stern gaze softened for a fleeting moment before he replied, "Redemption is not given, officer. It is earned through change. You must decide which path you are willing to take." Meanwhile, Angela Carter continued to nurture the grassroots movement with the steady determination of someone who had witnessed too many injustices to stand by silently. Her cafe hosted nightly gatherings where residents could speak freely, ask questions, and plan peaceful demonstrations. The faces around her table, young activists, elderly citizens, and even disillusioned former officers, mirrored the complexities of a community in transition. In each conversation, Angela's gentle wisdom served as a balm, encouraging everyone to hold on to their dignity even as they fought for a better tomorrow. As the saga unfolded, Maya Lawson found herself thrust into the limelight as a fearless chronicler of the community's struggles. Her digital stories, interwoven with eyewitness accounts and expert analysis, began to shape the national dialogue. In one of her most poignant reports, Maya captured the raw emotion of a protest that had erupted in downtown Riverside Grove, a sea of people united by their shared longing for justice. The footage was intercut with quiet interviews and whispered confessions, leaving viewers with an indelible impression of a community determined to rise above a legacy of neglect and discrimination. Her work not only fueled public debate but also inspired many to join the fight for accountability. During a particularly charged town hall meeting held in the renovated Civic Center, Marcus Reed took the stage once more. The packed room listened intently as he recounted his personal journey, a story marked by countless nights of quiet resolve and the unwavering determination to protect his family's honor. "We have witnessed the fault lines in our system," he declared, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of emotion, "but we also see the promise of a future where those fault lines can be healed by our collective action. It is up to us, as citizens, as parents, as friends, to hold our leaders accountable and to demand nothing less than true justice." The assembly erupted in applause, a resounding affirmation of the community's newfound resolve. The debate that followed was vigorous, filled with ideas on reform, reconciliation, and the kind of transparency that was long overdue. Each proposal, each passionate plea, underscored the deep desire for a transformation that embraced both accountability and empathy. In the midst of these events, Darius's personal journey continued to evolve. He began participating in volunteer programs and even delivered a heartfelt speech at a youth rally organized by the newly formed Independent Oversight Committee. His words, honest, raw, and infused with the quiet strength of his lived experience, resonated deeply with his peers. "I stand before you not as a martyr of injustice, but as a living testament to our capacity for change," he said. "Every step we take together, every protest, every meeting, is a stride toward a future where no one has to endure what we have." At the same time, private conversations emerged among the more introspective residents, a recognition that the path forward was fraught with challenges. In whispered exchanges in backyards and over kitchen tables, many expressed the fear that the growing division might eventually erupt into violence if not carefully navigated. Yet, even in these moments of vulnerability, the collective sentiment leaned toward hope. The community was not content to be defined by its past missteps, it was determined to build a legacy of resilience and unity. As the chapter of upheaval and reform deepened, Riverside Grove's story became a beacon for other towns grappling with similar issues of power, privilege, and prejudice. The nation's eyes turned to this once quiet suburb now pulsing with the energy of transformation. What began as a single, painful encounter between a teenager and an overzealous officer had blossomed into a movement for systemic change, a testament to the indomitable strength of a community that refused to be broken. In a final, poignant moment of that tumultuous season, on a rainy evening that mirrored the emotional turbulence of the times, Darius stood alone at the edge of the park. As the raindrops mingled with tears on his face, he felt the raw intensity of every sacrifice made by his community. In that instant of solitude, he understood that the battle for true accountability was not just an external struggle, it was also an internal journey, one that required constant vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption. What do you think is the most essential quality for a community to overcome deep-rooted injustice? How can individual acts of bravery contribute to collective transformation? Share your thoughts and join the conversation below. The atmosphere in Riverside Grove had reached a fever pitch. After weeks of protests, town halls, and whispered strategies shared over steaming cups of coffee at Crescent Brew, the community now braced itself for a moment that many feared yet anticipated, a decisive confrontation between the forces of reform and those clinging to an old order. Every face in the town, every tired but determined heart, pulsed with the hope that, at last, justice might prevail. For Darius Reed, the journey that began with a single, painful encounter on Maple Avenue had led him through the labyrinth of personal loss, collective struggle, and unexpected triumphs. Now, Standing on the front steps of his high school as a large crowd gathered on the parking lot, Darius felt both the weight of his experience and a profound responsibility to be the voice of a generation determined to reclaim dignity. The annual school assembly, once a routine event, had transformed into an impromptu stage for a nationwide conversation on systemic injustice. Amid bright banners and the murmur of thousands of collective resolve, the tension was palpable, a silent promise that nothing would remain unchallenged. Inside the school auditorium, Marcus Reed addressed the assembled parents, students, and community leaders. His steady, resonant tone cut through the buzz of uncertainty. Our struggle is not a momentary spark, it is a movement. Together, we have the power to force accountability, to rewrite the narratives of discrimination, and to stand up for every person who has been silenced by fear. His words, filled with both sorrow and strength, galvanized the audience into a unified roar that echoed far beyond the high walls of the institution. At the same time, Angela Carter organized a parallel demonstration outside the school. Her call for unity, and for the removal of any remnants of unchecked authority, had drawn a diverse coalition, families, civil rights groups, students, and even former officers who had witnessed firsthand the corrosive effects of prejudice. Homemade signs with messages like, "Courage over cruelty," and "Our voices matter," filled the sidewalks, while spontaneous speeches and passionate chants rippled through the crowd. Yet, beneath the surface of this organized resistance simmered the counterforce orchestrated by those within the law enforcement ranks. The leaked internal memo about the covert task force, now public knowledge, had rattled the core of the Riverside Grove Police Department. In dimly lit meeting rooms far removed from the public eye, a group of high-ranking officers convened, their expressions grim and taut. Their plan was covert, dangerous, and had the singular aim of quelling the activist tide through intimidation and unfettered authority. They feared that the reforms demanded by the community would not only shatter their hierarchical order but also expose years of malpractice that they had fought hard to keep hidden. Officer Morgan Tate, whose name had become emblematic of the system's excesses, now faced a crossroads. Isolated by his colleagues and haunted by his own misdeeds, he was drawn into a desperate inner conflict. Late one night, in a nearly abandoned precinct building, Tate sat in a darkened office surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and scattered papers. The echo of the aggressive demands made during the controversial incident replayed in his mind. With a trembling hand, he dialed a number he once thought he would never call, a number of a trusted old friend from his early days in the force, a man who had always preached redemption and accountability. In that fraught conversation, Tate's voice broke as he admitted, "I don't know if I can undo the past, but maybe I can choose a different future." The words hung in the air like a fragile olive branch, suggesting that even in the darkest corners of bureaucracy, change might be possible. Over in the community, Maya Lawson's digital chronicles had now merged into an unstoppable campaign for transparency. Her meticulously edited footage of protests, town hall debates, and, notably, the gathering of police memos was being shared not only across local social media platforms but had begun to draw national attention. Journalists from across the country visited Riverside Grove, and soon the once sleepy suburb found itself under an unblinking media spotlight. In every headline and broadcast, the narrative of a community rising up against entrenched injustice was being championed. However, with the newfound attention came heightened danger. Anonymous messages and threats began to trickle into Maya's inbox, urging her to stop meddling and let the system sort itself out. But undeterred, she continued to document and expose the actions of the covert task force, knowing that truth was the only weapon capable of disarming corruption. As the fateful day approached, the day when the two worlds of reform and repression would inevitably collide, the streets of Riverside Grove thrummed with restless energy. Secret meetings were held in back rooms and community centers, where plans for a massive, peaceful rally were solidified. The aim was not to incite chaos, but to force the hand of the local government and police department into compliance with the community's demands. In hushed yet fervent tones, activists and concerned citizens rehearsed their chants and signaled their support for the fight against systemic oppression. On the morning of the decisive demonstration, the town awoke to an almost surreal calm. The sky, a soft gradient of pre-dawn blues and purples, quietly heralded the coming storm of voices, convictions, and, perhaps, confrontations. Darius, now recognized as a critical leader among his peers, led a small group of students to a strategically chosen location just outside the school. They set up an impromptu platform, their expressions resolute despite the chill in the air. It was a moment of catharsis, a declaration that youth would no longer be marginalized, that their voices were as vital as those of their elders. Across town, the covert police faction mobilized with a cold precision. Under the cover of the early light, a few unmarked vehicles rolled silently through less traveled streets, their occupants clad in nondescript uniforms and dark sunglasses. Their orders were clear: to monitor, intimidate, and if necessary, to use force to quell the peaceful assembly. The risk of such an operation lingering in the background was a constant, ominous reminder that the battle for change was as much about safeguarding human dignity as it was about survival in the face of authoritarian might. As the noon hour neared, the peaceful protest escalated into a massive gathering. Riverside Grove's main street became a river of humanity, different ages, backgrounds, and beliefs united in their demand for accountability. Speeches were made, songs were sung, and the collective spirit was palpable in every uplifted hand and resolute step. Marcus Reed, standing on a makeshift stage constructed near the town square, delivered a speech that cut through the clamor like a clarion call. Today, we demand not just reform but a rebirth, a new era of transparency, where every officer is held accountable, where our community is respected, and where our children can dream without fear. His words were met with a surge of applause, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if hope was tangible, a shared, shimmering promise that united all in the struggle for justice. Yet, amid the jubilation, tension continued to mount. Screens affixed on mobile devices showed live updates from Maya's stream, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation for what might come next. Then, as if orchestrated by fate itself, the fateful clash came swiftly. At the edge of the protest, where the line between peaceful assembly and the covert operatives blurred, an altercation broke out. A small group of uniformed figures, emerging from a shadowed alleyway, began advancing toward the demonstrators. Their presence was a stark contrast to the organized, passionate crowd, a symbol of the hidden forces determined to reinstate the old order by any means necessary. The demonstrators, led by Darius and backed by veterans of many previous protests, met the advance with peaceful defiance. Shouts of "No justice, no peace" filled the air as the two groups converged near the entrance of the town hall. In that charged moment, every heartbeat in Riverside Grove synchronized in a collective rhythm of determination. The covert officers, caught off guard by the sheer number of unified voices and faces, hesitated. Their orders had been clear, yet the resolute gaze of citizens, young and old, challenged their every intention. A tense standoff ensued. Police radios crackled with urgent, indistinct commands. The gathered crowd created a human barrier, and as the situation teetered on the brink of violence, Marcus Reed stepped forward. With calm authority, he addressed both the demonstrators and the officers: "This is our home, our future. We demand that you listen, not with the sound of your words, but with the weight of your conscience." His plea hung in the air, a delicate balance between defiance and hope. For a long, suspended moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, as if released from an invisible hold, the covert operatives slowly retreated, their advance stymied by the sheer force of collective will. In the background, Officer Tate, still wrestling with his inner turmoil, watched from a distance. The victory was bittersweet, a testament to the power of unity, yet a reminder that the struggle was far from over. His eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and sorrow. In that moment, he knew that redemption required not only accountability from others but transformation within himself. That day marked a turning point in Riverside Grove's tumultuous narrative. The protest, anchored in peaceful resistance, unwavering truth, and the courageous outpouring of community spirit, became a landmark event. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, calls for national reform echoed from every corner of the country. Legislators, influenced by the raw emotion and undeniable unity of the Riverside Grove demonstrators, began drafting proposals for long overdue systemic changes. The covert task force that had once threatened to silence dissent fell apart under the weight of public pressure and internal betrayals. Transparency boards were established, independent investigations were launched, and, for the first time in decades, the people of Riverside Grove began to reclaim their power. As dusk fell over the town that evening, Darius stood beneath the vast expanse of a starlit sky, reflecting on the day's events. His heart, though still carrying scars of past injustices, beat with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The journey had been arduous, marked by sorrow, conflict, and the looming specter of repression, but in every gesture of solidarity, every shout for justice, the promise of a more compassionate future shone through. What do you believe defines true accountability in the face of long-standing injustice? How can communities continue to harness the strength of peaceful resistance even when the odds seem insurmountable? Share your thoughts below and join the conversation. In the weeks following the turning point on that fateful day, Riverside Grove slowly began to heal its wounds and redefine its future. The city that once trembled under the weight of oppression and the threat of unchecked authority was now witnessing a transformation that reached deep into every corner of its community. The events that had shaken the town, from the heroic stand of peaceful protesters to the quiet confessions of those in the police force, had left an indelible mark on every resident's heart, binding them together in a collective journey toward renewal. Darius Reed had emerged not only as a symbol of youthful resistance but as a genuine leader who inspired hope through his compassion and resilience. In the days that followed, he spent more time mentoring his fellow students, organizing discussion groups, and working with the newly formed Independent Oversight Board. His once painful memories now served as the crucible from which a determined vision for a better future was forged. Every morning, when he walked past the vibrant murals on the walls of Crescent Brew, mosaics of unity and dreams, the scars of his past slowly softened, replaced by the promise of change and the warmth of community solidarity. At school, initiatives once seen as radical started to integrate into the institution's culture. Teachers began including lessons on civil rights, social justice, and personal responsibility into their curricula, sparking thoughtful debates in classrooms where students once sat silently. Ms. Evelyn Burke, the guidance counselor who had so often comforted anxious hearts, took on a new role as mediator between generations. Her gentle guidance helped bridge the gap between the dreams of the youth and the cautious memories of an older era. She often said, "We build our future not by erasing our past, but by learning from it and daring to be better." Marcus Reed, a man whose quiet determination had driven so much of the early momentum for change, now found himself both exhausted and uplifted by the community's resilience. His nights remained long, filled with continued drafting of reform proposals and dialogues with local lawmakers who, inspired by the public outcry, were slowly relinquishing outdated policies. Marcus spent an afternoon at a community planning session held at the town's old civic center, a grand building whose historical arches bore silent witness to the struggles and triumphs of previous generations. In that hall, voices once muffled by fear now resonated with hope as residents, activists, and even some reformed police officers shared ideas for a policing model built on transparency, accountability, and compassion. Marcus observed that genuine change was a slow process, one that required persistent effort every single day, but he also saw that every heartfelt conversation, every collective sigh of relief, was a step toward a more just Riverside Grove. Angela Carter, whose cafe had become a nucleus of community strength and creative activism, continued to nurture conversations that united people from all walks of life. Every morning at Crescent Brew, the aroma of freshly ground coffee intertwined with the lively banter of patrons who debated policies and shared personal stories of resilience. Angela's own transformation, from a simple cafe owner to a respected community leader, was evident in her gentle yet assertive demeanor. She organized workshops where elders recounted the struggles of past decades and where youths expressed their hopes for a future marked by inclusivity. The signs that hung inside her cafe, "Unity in Diversity," and "Every Voice Counts," became rallying mantras for residents who no longer felt invisible or marginalized. Maya Lawson, the intrepid chronicler whose camera had captured the raw truth of Riverside Grove's struggle, experienced a profound shift in her role as well. Her digital stories had not only brought local injustice to national attention but had also inspired a generation of citizen journalists and activists to document their own realities. Maya's work had evolved beyond mere reportage. She became a trusted voice that reminded people that truth thrives in the light. Despite receiving occasional threats and facing scrutiny from adversaries, Maya continued to post updates that fused powerful imagery with personal narratives. Her latest series, titled Renewal in Riverside, focused on the quiet moments of triumph, a protester's tearful smile after a long battle, a policeman's guarded yet hopeful confession in a secret interview, and community celebrations that underscored the collective journey toward redemption. Amid these diverse efforts for change, not all scars were immediately healed. Officer Morgan Tate, whose missteps had once symbolized the abuses of a flawed system, now faced a long and uncertain road to redemption. Following his moment of vulnerability, where he had reached out to a trusted friend in the force, Tate was placed under a rigorous program of reform and counseling. His journey was marked by public accountability meetings where he was required to confront the very behaviors that had once alienated him from his community. In one such meeting, surrounded by community leaders, fellow officers, and residents still haunted by memories of past injustices, Tate admitted in a quiet, halting voice, "I am not the man I once was. I owe it to every person in this community to change, to learn what it means to truly serve." Though his words could not undo the harm inflicted, they opened a narrow door toward reconciliation. Some remained skeptical, but many recognized that the path to systemic healing required even those who had faltered to undertake a sincere journey of transformation. Detective Warren, whose tireless efforts to bridge the growing rift had started to make inroads, continued his coffee and community sessions. Though initially met with mixed reactions, the sessions gradually became safe havens where disillusioned officers and wary citizens could meet on neutral ground. Slowly, in these candid conversations, distrust gave way to tentative mutual understanding. It was not an immediate cure, but it was a promising sign that change, however small, could be cultivated even in the most embattled institutions. The political response to the series of reform movements was palpable as well. Local legislators, pressured by the united call of the people and emboldened by compelling evidence of systemic failings, began drafting new policies aimed at transforming law enforcement practices across Riverside Grove. A historic bill was introduced, one that would establish an independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate complaints against the police and propose disciplinary measures. Public hearings became events in which every member of the community was invited to speak, listen, and share their vision for a safer, more equitable future. The debates, though often heated, were underscored by an emerging consensus that accountability must be the cornerstone of any society that wished to thrive in dignity. In the streets and neighborhoods, change manifested not only in policy but in small, powerful acts of everyday life. Children who once grew up in the shadow of mistrust now played beneath the same old oak trees where community meetings were held. Neighbors who had once exchanged furtive glances over garden fences now engaged in friendly chats, sharing produce from their own gardens and stories of resilience. The once stark divisions that had defined Riverside Grove began to blur as residents chose to see each other not as strangers defined by old stereotypes, but as cohabitants in a shared narrative of struggle and renewal. As the season of renewal advanced into a hopeful autumn, Riverside Grove organized its first Day of Unity, a public event designed to celebrate the progress made and to remind every resident that the journey toward lasting change was a collective endeavor. The event was held in the town's Central Park, a sprawling green space that had, in the past, served only as the backdrop for routine weekend picnics. Now, it was adorned with banners, colorful art installations, and stages where speakers, musicians, and poets recited words of hope and defiance. Marcus Reed, Angela Carter, Maya Lawson, and even a reformed Officer Tate were invited as special guests, their stories interwoven into the tapestry of communal healing. On the day of the celebration, the park buzzed with excitement. Families spread picnic blankets under the open sky, elderly couples sat reminiscing about the bygone days, and young activists led impromptu dance sessions that broke down any lingering barriers between generations. The highlight of the day was a collective mural, where every willing resident was invited to paint a small segment that contributed to a grand image symbolizing unity, a phoenix rising amidst chaos, a bold image that captured the essence of Riverside Grove's metamorphosis. Darius, standing beside the mural, could hardly contain his emotion as he listened to heartfelt testimonials about what this movement had meant to them. He thought of the painful days and the sleepless nights, all of which had culminated in a moment of shared triumph that transcended any individual sorrow. Later in the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight, the community gathered around a large bonfire. There, amid the glow of flickering flames and the hum of gentle conversation, Marcus Reed delivered a final, impassioned address. "Today," he said, his voice resonant and firm, "we honor not only our struggles but the unbreakable spirit that resides in each of us. We have shown that even in the darkest moments, when injustice loomed like an insurmountable wall, our collective courage lit the way. Let this bonfire remind us that together, our light will never be extinguished." Tears glistened in the eyes of many, including Darius, who had grown from a lone victim of injustice into a beacon of hope for his peers. In that moment of unity, Riverside Grove embraced its future, a future where every voice mattered, where every experience, however painful, contributed to the evolution of a community committed to accountability and compassion. As the evening drew to a close and the bonfire's embers burned low, residents slowly dispersed, each carrying with them the memory of a day that had transformed lives. Conversations continued on, plans were made for further reforms, and the promise of a more just society lingered in the cool night air. The journey was far from over, but the foundation had been laid, a resilient, united community determined to confront injustice wherever it might arise. What do you believe is the true measure of a community's strength in times of profound change? How can individual acts of redemption and courage contribute to forging a unified future? Share your thoughts and experiences, and join the conversation as we continue to explore what it means to overcome adversity together. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Your support and engagement remind us that even the smallest voice can ignite change, and together, we are capable of rewriting narratives and healing the scars of the past. If you found this story inspiring and believe in the message of unity and transformation, please join our growing community. Subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts, and help us spread love and hope to every corner of the world. With heartfelt gratitude and love, thank you for being a part of this journey.